So this is about the cardiovascular system. It's used in everyday life, for example, gas exchange in the lungs, providing blood with oxygen and expelling metabolic waste like carbon dioxide. Oxygenated blood supplies working muscles with oxygen to keep them working, and they also transport things like nutrients and hormones to cells around the body. Functions of the cardiovascular system. First one is nutrients delivery. So blood contains four things: platelets, plasma, red and white blood cells. Nutrients are carried in the plasma and diffuse into cells through capillaries. Before this, the nutrients are absorbed into the blood through the intestines when food has been broken down. Another function is waste product removal. So during respiration and other bodily functions, waste products are produced that need to be removed from the body. Some examples of these are ammonia and carbon dioxide. The cardiovascular system is used to excrete carbon dioxide. This is done by diffusion of carbon dioxide that occurs in the alveoli in the lungs. The carbon dioxide is diffused out of the bloodstream, travelling through capillaries, and they're replaced by oxygen. It's then exhaled out of the body. Another function is transport of oxygen. So both the heart and lungs are used to transport oxygen around the body. The lungs remove the carbon dioxide from the blood in gas exchange, as we just looked at, and supply it with oxygen. The heart then contracts and relaxes to transport oxygenated blood around the body to the muscle cells where it's diffused into them. Oxygen in the red blood cells is carried by hemoglobin. When hemoglobin is full of oxygen, it then becomes oxyhemoglobin. Another function is clotting and protection. So platelets and white blood cells are both used in clotting when the skin is cut and leaving the body. They seal the skin so no more blood can leave. This is very important because if too much blood is lost from the body, and also then it's bad, and it also prevents bacteria and pathogens from entering the body and causing illness. If pathogens do enter the body, the white blood cells can protect us from them by destroying them. Thermoregulation is the last function of the cardiovascular system and is done by vasoconstriction and vasodilation, where capillaries are either retracted away or dilated closer to the skin surface to conserve or lose heat. The pulmonary circuit is next. The cardiovascular system consists of two circuits which the blood travels around: the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit is the circuit between the heart and lungs, mainly consists of deoxygenated blood when it exits the heart out the pulmonary artery to the lungs where gas exchange takes place so that the blood can become oxygenated. This happens in the alveoli of the lungs, where capillaries run next to them, diffusing oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out. The oxygenated blood then leaves the lungs, enters the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. The blood is then transported into the left ventricle and then around the rest of the body by the aorta. The systemic circuit is the second part, and it's very important because it's used to take blood around the body, supplying cells with oxygen and removing waste products like carbon dioxide. The circuit starts at the aorta, where the blood is pumped to working cells through arteries and then to arterioles, which branch into systemic capillaries, where oxygen is diffused into the cells. The blood is then taken back to the arteries by venules. The blood is now deoxygenated as it's given the oxygen to the muscle cells and will start to return to the heart. The blood will travel through the superior vena cava if it's in the top of the body, and the inferior vena cava if it's from the bottom of the body. Muscles need blood to supply them in order to work. This is why the circuit is so important. The heart acts as a dual pump as the contractions occur at different times. So the first pump is the deoxygenated blood going out of the heart towards the lungs so that it can become oxygenated, and the second pump, after the blood's returned to the heart, is the blood going to the rest of the body. And this is important as we don't want deoxygenated blood going into the rest of the body, because then the cells will not get oxygen. So the structure and function of the heart, it has many structures and functions, and we'll start with the endocardium, which is similar to the cells that line the blood vessels, and they line the chambers of the heart, providing protection to the valves and chambers. The epicardium is the outer layer of the heart, mainly made of connective tissue, and is also just a protective layer. The pericardium has two layers, the parietal and visceral, and it lubricates the heart to reduce friction. The atria are the upper chambers of the heart, smaller than the ventricles. It takes blood into the heart and sends them into the ventricle, either by passively filling them or by the systole of the heart. The bicuspid valve is connected to the chordae tendineae, also called the mitral valve, as it has two flaps. It allows blood to flow from the left atria to the left ventricle without any backflow. The tricuspid valve between the right atrium and right ventricle prevents backflow into the atrium. So the chordae tendineae, they connect to the papillary muscles and to the tricuspid and bicuspid valve, and they're very strong. So their function is to shut the flaps of the valves to prevent any blood flowing back into the atrium. So the papillary muscles that the chordae tendineae attach to, they're in the ventricles. They prevent prolapse of the bicuspid and tricuspid valve, meaning that the blood can't flow backwards. And the aortic valve has three flaps that open and close to control blood flow in and out of the heart. They shut the left ventricle to hold oxygenated blood before the ventricular systole begins, then opens to allow blood out of the heart. The pulmonary valve is the right ventricle of the heart, what is in the right ventricle of the heart, and this opens and closes to control blood flow, allows blood to be sent to the lungs without allowing backflow. So the cardiac cycle, and this is very important, this is just in what order the blood enters and leaves the heart. So the systole is the contraction of the atrium and ventricles when pumping out of veins, arteries, or through valves. For example, ventricular systole involves two stages: ventricular contraction, which is just systole, and ventricular ejection. Diastole is the relaxation phase when blood is entering the heart. The conduction system of the heart, caused by mechanical and electrical stimulations, causing certain areas of the heart to contract, relax, or open. The first stage is from the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, where the impulse is sent to the left atria, causing atrial systole. The impulse then goes to the atrioventricular node, where the impulse is then literally just passed down the bundle of His and down the septum to the Purkinje fibers and the bundle branch. The heart now contracts, pumping the blood around the body. The cardiac cycle is controlled by the conduction system. Starts with ventricular diastole, so there's no conduction. Passive filling of the ventricles, also no conduction. And atrial systole then begins, which is an impulse from the sinoatrial node. Ventricular systole then begins after getting an impulse from the atrioventricular node, and ventricular systole then finishes after there is no impulse from the atrioventricular node. The process then keeps repeating itself. The autonomic nervous system works on feedback from the body. More demand for oxygen requires the autonomic nervous system to work harder. When there is a high demand of this, the sympathetic nerve or the accelerator nerve gets an impulse from the cardiac control center in the medulla oblongata, which is in the brain, telling the cardiovascular system to speed up. The vagus nerve or parasympathetic nervous system inhibits the heart rate when needed. The heart rate can be affected by certain factors like excitement, fear, and hormones like adrenaline and other things like that. Blood and blood vessels. Blood and blood vessels are very important to the cardiovascular system, as blood transports nutrients, platelets, oxygen, and white blood cells around the body, and blood vessels transport blood around the body, and also have a role in thermal regulation, which we've been through. Blood structure and function. Blood contains 4 components. Red blood cells are 40 to 45% of blood. White blood cells are about 1% of blood. Platelets and plasma, well, platelets are about 1% and plasma is about 55%, but this can vary. So the red blood cells have another name called erythrocytes. They're oval, biconcave discs containing hemoglobin stored in the cytoplasm, and they have no nucleus, so they can have more space for hemoglobin to carry oxygen to the cells. Another word for white blood cells is leukocytes, and they're the biggest component of blood produced in the bone marrow, and they obviously prevent infection and kill pathogens. Platelets are proteins on the surface and only 20% of the diameter of red blood cells. They obviously have a role in clotting of the blood to prevent any, a lot of blood leaving the body. And then plasma is a liquid part of the blood carrying the nutrients, waste and protein around the body. Blood vessels, structure and function. There are 5 different types of blood vessels in the body, and they all have different structures and functions to aid different structures to aid the functions. The 5 types of blood vessels are arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins and venules, and they all have different roles. So the structure and function of artery is that it has a very large lumen, but not the largest. This is so that it can allow a lot of blood through at a time. It has 3 layers: the tunica, intima, media and externa. So that's just 3 separate layers. That's the middle, outer and inner. It transports oxygenated blood away from the heart, apart from the pulmonary artery. The arteriole is a branch of arteries before going into capillaries, so they're like small arteries that transport the blood into capillaries, and they have small lumen and are quite thin. They're part of the sympathetic nervous system and dilate and constrict to regulate blood flow. That's the that's the thermoregulation. So capillaries, they're 1 cell thick, so that there's a short diffusion pathway for gas exchange. They've got a very small lumen, as not a lot of blood's going to be going through them all at one time, apart from the fact that there is a lot of them. So overall there will be a lot of blood going through. And they're made up of 1 layer of endothelial cells. They work in internal and external gas exchange. Internal gas exchange is only just blood and muscles, and external is between the alveoli and the capillaries. They carry blood close to the alveoli and muscle cells so that gas can diffuse in and out. The venule, they not much structure about them. They just have a very small lumen, and obviously they're not very big. They transport deoxygenated blood from the capillary beds to veins. So it's sort of like the opposite of the arteriole. Veins have the largest lumen, but they're not as thick as arteries, as the blood will not be going under such pressure. They have 3 layers, which are sort of the same as an artery: the tunica, externa, media and intima, so the middle, outer and internal. And they also carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart, obviously except the pulmonary vein, which carries oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. Yeah.